What does it mean to be black in Latin America or to be black Latino in the United States? Well, the answer depends on who you ask, because while some may proudly embrace it, others are quicker to downplay it or maybe even outright deny it. Take the Dominican Republic, for example. Despite 90% of its population being of African descent, many still struggle to accept their roots. Let's take a look at this clip from a PBS documentary, Black in Latin America.
I had to learn to be black.
How did you learn?
Well, I went to New York as most Dominican, and all of a sudden I felt that my roots were in Africa, not in Spain like here. Even today, here everybody says the motherland here is Spain.
So who's black in Dominican society? In America, all these people would be black. But here, who's black?
Well,
Negro. Who's the Negro?
I think nobody's Negro here.
As you can see, it's a complex issue, and it's a question that's still being debated there, just like it is here in the United States. Well, joining us to discuss some of this is Biani Perez. She is a graduate student at Bryn Mawr College. We also have Christopher Pimentel, a finance student at Baruch College. Silvio Torres Sayant joins us. He's an English professor at Syracuse University. We're also joined by Kimberly Simmons, associate professor of anthropology and African American studies at University of South Carolina. She's also the author of a book, Reconstructing Racial Identity and the African Past in the Dominican Republic. And Robin Derby, last but not least, joins us. She's associate professor of history at UCLA and author of the Dominican Republic Reader. I'm going to start with you, Kimberly. How does this happen? Right? Like, how do you end up in a place that is so overrepresented by African bodies, African ancestry, African stuff, and yet still has this sort of denial of African identity?
Well, thanks for having me on, Mark. It's great to be here and be part of this wonderful panel. I would like to start out by saying that I think we have to think about how we're socialized and think about different contexts in which we're socialized. So when we think about Dominican, the blackness being denied in the Dominican Republic, I always have to think about it in terms of Dominicans having their blackness denied them by the state. And what that means is, in terms of how they were socialized to think about blackness, to think about themselves as being a mixed people, and if they talk about it in terms of Indio Claro, light skin, Indio Scuro, in terms of dark skin, Haitians were often the other. They were the ones who were considered to be black. And so the cultural meaning of blackness is different in the Dominican Republic, although it is changing. There are groups that are challenging the notion of being black. There are groups that are challenging and actually embracing this idea of being Afro-Dominican. So I think it's learned in terms of how we are socialized at home, among our peers, and also in other institutions. But it is changing.
But give me just a simple layout.
Okay.
Of what some of the racial identity frames are, how people sort of categorize in a place like there, as opposed to the simple black-white paradigm of the U.S.
So, for example, when I first went there about 20 years ago, I started this research for a master's thesis, and I was asking questions about race. And so when I started asking about it, I found it wasn't as simple as saying, black and white. Because oftentimes Dominicans would say, we're like a sancocho, which is the national dish, like a stew. We're mixed. And so they always enter at that point of being mixed, and then they would say Haitians are black. And so along the lines of mixture, they use this category Indio. Now, among African Americans in the States, the way that translates in the way is similar is to say someone is light-skinned or dark skin. So they would use Indio as this mixed category and then have this spectrum of light to dark and say somebody is light, someone's cinnamon colored, someone is, brown skin. They have a way of talking about it, usually in terms of Indio, and that's the way it's talked about. And it gets captured on their cedula, which is their national identification card. So on the national ID card, at least back in 1988, or 1998, when I was doing the research for the book and my dissertation, I found it had different categories, and Indio was one of them. So it was Indio, there was white, which really meant, for people who were mainly European immigrants, black was on there, Negro was on there, and it was often used for very dark Dominicans or Dominican Haitians. Then there was Amarillo, which was, the Asian Dominican category. So it was interesting, Indio was supposed to represent that mixed group, but they also had Mulatto there, which was new. Now, that's since changed recently with Mulatto there, but in 1998, Indio was that all-encompassing category representing mixture, and it still is in terms of popular culture.
Okay, that's actually very helpful. And Robin, then help me understand how that connects to the kind of political projects that have operated both in the Dominican Republic and also even in Haiti, and how that plays into the racial politic here.
Well, I think
to really understand Dominican racial identity, you have to step back a little bit earlier in history and go back to the kind of the racial formation of and colonial society. And the Dominican Republic, is the outlier in the Caribbean because it did not have plantation slavery. Most of the slaves came in very early and mixed, and the country was kind of a colonial backwater for such a long time. And so it didn't get this, I think one of the reasons why you get this racialized national identity, this kind of idea that Haitians constitute blackness, is because of the contract labor scheme, which brought Haitians in to cut cane. And that associated Haitians as this stigmatized group associated with a form of labor that was virtually slavery. So to me, that's really key. I mean, the standard story is that, the anti-Haitianism arises with the Haitian occupation. And I don't think that's the case, because in the 19th century, Haiti was still a more economically, important country. It wasn't until the 20th century and the contract labor scheme that the U.S. sugar corporations brought to bear that Haitians and blackness became associated with this kind of debased form of labor associated with slavery. So I would say that it before you get to this Trujillo and the Duvalier and the state, you have to go there.
Wow, that's a fascinating thing. But then that puts us, Silvio, in a framework where we're trying to figure out exactly where people began to reject African identity vis-a-vis all these processes we've just talked about, whether it's Trujillo, whether it's pre-Trujillo, whether it's whatever the circumstances politically, economically. There is a moment that we can sort of pinpoint in history where people began to reject African identity as a legitimate kind of source of their identity.
Well, I would like to reconsider the sort of presumption of the question that somehow African identity is something that is inherent in a person who has African origins. I actually think that we might want to start by believing what we say in the classroom when we repeat ad nauseam that race is socially constructed. We cannot continue to say that race is socially constructed, while at the same time having a kind of, a model that requires for all groups to construct it in the same way. I don't know, I mean...
Let me pause you there for 1 second, Silvio, just because I want to make sure I understand this with clarity. The idea of race as a social construct is one thing, right? It simply means that the sort of biological, that the biological features of race, skin color, et cetera, do not necessarily over-determine our identities, right? That much of this stuff is socially constructed. The meaning attached to those biological realities are socially constructed. I get that. But there is a sort of verifiable historical line and cultural line between people who live in Brazil, who live in DR, who live in Haiti, who live in Puerto Rico, who live in Cuba, who live in the United States, and the continent of Africa in terms of cultural retentions, in terms of rituals, in terms of religious practices, in terms of foods, in terms of dance, in terms of epistemologies and cosmologies. I mean, all that stuff is in fact linked to Africa, sort of indisputably. That's not a social construct, right?
Well, no, I think what identity is not linked to Africa. Identity is linked to the kind of experience that enslaved Africans went through in the Americas as captured. They were not slaves. They were not captured. They were not captives in Africa. Their identity begins. Their identity as a maligned population begins in the Americas. And the question is, how does it happen in each of the particular sites in which you get these large cohorts of people of enslaved people of African descent? In the United States, I remember with much appreciation Kimberly Simmons's presentation, I think at a panel that we shared at Yale University, hosted by Dominican students.
And she was actually drawing interesting parallels between the various ways that African Americans throughout history have used to refer to themselves, which are different ways of referring to different metaphors of blackness, which refer to gradations. And I remember speaking with a distinguished social scientist, Sandy Darity, who actually says, I don't know what they're talking about when they speak about the various ways that Dominicans have of referring to their blackness, or the various degrees of blackness, because we have them too. And so, I mean, I remember when I first saw Tina Turner wearing blonde hair, I actually thought that was a humongous betrayal of the race, because at the time, you were expected, I mean, at the time, relaxed hair meant a denial of your blackness. That's not the case anymore. But for instance, what does it mean, for instance, when you have a significant number of African-American males who do not choose African-American women as their partners, and who in certain surveys show a preference for other racial or ethnic groups. I actually believe that...
That's a powerful point you raised. But just, let me push back just a little bit, and then I got to get Biani and Christopher in. So, but is there a difference between the sort of individual agency that a person can take up by saying, I'm going to wear blonde hair, or I'm going to date someone who's not black, or I'm going to remove myself from the black community, either ideologically or physically, and even saying, I'm not African, right, as a kind of way of self-identifying. Is there a difference between that and outright denial of the African presence in your cultural makeup? It seems to me that there's a difference between...
I do not know one single Dominican who denies African descent. I do not know one single Dominican who denies African descent. What I do know is Dominicans who do not choose to call themselves black as their primary social identity. Yeah?
Interesting.
And that, I think, has to be put in context.
That's fair. That's fair. Let me bring Biani and Christopher in. Biani, you identify as black, no?
Yes,
and
I identify as black. Mm-hmm.
To what extent was that a very conscious choice? To what extent was that a political choice? To what extent was that something that you were just born into?
I think it was a little bit of everything, Mark. I think I grew up in the South Bronx to Dominican immigrant parents, and I learned that I was black from my experience here. I grew up in a predominantly African-American and Puerto Rican neighborhood. At the time in the early 90s, there were no Dominicans where I was living except us. So I learned early on that my skin color and my hair were markers of my blackness.
So to put it crudely, did you not have the opportunity to opt out of blackness given your kind of social and political location?
No, not really. I mean, for many people in the fact that the way that I look challenged the idea of being Latina. I didn't look like a quote-unquote stereotypical Latina for people. I felt like I had to constantly prove who I was to people, proving that I was Dominican, proving that I spoke Spanish, proving that my parents were from Santo Domingo. And over time, I found a lot of solidarity with African Americans and darker-skinned Latinos who really had similar experiences as me.
Wow. And so for you, it was less about proving blackness or verifying blackness. It was much more about proving your kind of your Latinness.
Yes, very much so, and it still happens all the time.
Wow.
Yeah.
Christopher, is that your experience as well?
No, it's not. Hi, Mark. How are you?
Good, brother.
It's not actually. My experience is vastly different from hers. I am Dominican also, but as Professor Silvio said, I do not identify as black.
And why is that?
I mean, Dominicans in general, we do have African ancestry. How Silvio said it, we do admit it. It's being portrayed in the media as if we're in complete denial of it. Our music has African influences, and we admit it. The thing is, we do not identify as how Americans seem to construe things as either white or black. That whole one-drop rule does not operate in the Dominican Republic. It simply does not exist.
So how do you then translate that when you come to the States where, to say the NYPD, you are black, as opposed to this complex array of racial identity and racial formation?
Other.
Okay.
Simply put, other.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, please.
I think the idea that there's no such thing as blackness in Dominican Republic has a lot to do with the history of DR and the fact that there's this complexity with even before Trujillo, during Trujillo, and this Dominican identity being tied to anti-blackness. The fact that for Dominicans to identify as Dominicans is also to say that you're not Haitian. So for me, to identify as an Afro-Latina it's political, but it's also to acknowledge that not only are we African, but that we're also Black, and that we have this shared history with Haiti and Dominican Republic. So I hear the brother, and I respect your opinion, but I can't help but challenge you to think about the fact that a Dominican identity, this patriotic way of looking at Dominican identity is also anti-Black. And to say that you're not Black really misses the experiences of many Latinos in the US that have to experience the world as Black. And also the fact that we have to really challenge we have to challenge the fact that a Dominican identity is still seen as anti-Black and anti-Haitian. So that people are like, I'm a proud Dominican, but I'm not Black. I mean, we really have to have a conversation. I think we have to have a real conversation, and I think now's the time to really push the lens.
Let me ask you this question. Let me put it in a more scientific manner. When you mix iron with chromium, you get stainless steel. Everyone knows that. Now, the Dominican identity is an amalgamation. It's not solely Black, and it's not solely European. You're also forgetting the Taino component that is barely mentioned at all. So my question to you is, am I Black? Am I solely Black? Am I solely white?
You're not solely Black or solely white, but I think the danger of dismissing the Blackness is always the Blackness that gets denied. Regardless of, we embrace the Taino, we embrace the Indio, but we never talk about the fact that that we are also Black. So I'm not dismissing the fact that there are mixed people, but even in that conversation, even in my experience, I go into a bodega and people are always, oh my gosh, you speak Spanish so well. Oh my God, why do you look like that? You can't be Dominican, because in them embracing me as a Dominican, they also have to embrace Blackness. And that never happens. And that's been my experience, real talk. That never happens. We embrace Taino, even though there are not, a lot of history has told us, if you think about the Taino, our ancestors, I mean, the Blackness is there too. So, yeah.
So let me bring Silvio back in, only because, Silvio, you just spoke to this very thing. Biani makes an interesting point that sort of pushes back against your point about the kind of individual agency that one can exercise in choosing to identify as African or Black or not.
Well, I think what Biani says is actually very apropos of the situation. In the United States, where the racial politics operate in a certain way, it is even unsafe for you to try to exist outside of the confines of that racial regime, right? So you have to, in a sense, take sides. I mean, you may find yourself in a situation of having to adopt North American racial codes. Yeah, but that is different. That's a contextual thing. That is different from actually declaring that Dominicans have less racial proficiency than other African descended populations. The fact is that there is no society that has endured colonialism. There's no population that has endured colonialism and Black slavery that can actually say that it is free of Black issues. Blackness is a problem. Blackness was rendered a problem by over 400 years of continuous vilification, of continuous dehumanization. I mean, go to the greatest minds of the West, including our own Thomas Jefferson, and see the scandalous things that he comes up with to demonstrate the insufficient humanity or the lesser humanity.
But I guess that's the point. I guess that's the point for me.
That anybody can actually claim that our Black population has no issues. Yeah.
No. I think we're beginning from the premise that everybody who's been colonized has those issues. But because of that history, because of that history of anti-Black racism, because of the kind of post-Enlightenment or Enlightenment era sort of logic around Blackness from Jefferson and Hume and Kant and everybody else. If all that's happening, I don't see, and Kimberly, I want you to jump in, I don't see how avoiding the label of African, the identity of African, either here or throughout the diaspora, is not a rejection of blackness implicitly and a form of anti-black racism.
Well, picking up on what Sylvia was just saying a second ago, too, I mean, how do we see black? I mean, how is black, as a category? I mean, what Christopher was saying right now is that, in terms of the music, I mean, there are definitely African influences. We look at the food, we look at mannerisms, we look at all the things, we say the cultural traditions. We can definitely say West Africa has its imprint in the Dominican Republic. We can definitely see that. And so the term black, again, to use that there, when it's been used historically for Haitians, I think that's what's taking, some time to get used to, just that. Now you come to the United States and you have all these different efforts. You have the Afro-Latino Forum. They're saying you can be both and. It's not an either or. You don't have to be black or Dominican or Puerto Rican or black. You can be both and. And what I say in my African American Studies classes a lot of times is that to be black is to be mixed into the United States. We don't think about it that way, given our history. We talk about black, and we can talk about all the skin tones, all the, diversity within the community. And we look at Brazil, we look at Venezuela, we look at the Dominican Republic, we look at Puerto Rico, and we see very similar kinds of situations. But the term black can mean different things in different places. At the same time, I mean, because of the Black Power movement and the way we talk about global blackness, I think that now, different people, different activists, social scientists, others are, kind of picking up this idea of what does it mean to be black, in the diaspora. And Silvio said this, Silvio, you mentioned me with the Yale conference. I think about what you said too, in New York at the Afro-Latino Forum. You said there is no correct way of being black. And that's something that stayed with me, And why is it that
but might there be problematic ways of being black? But Kimberly, might there be problematic ways of being black or identifying as black?
Problematic way. Well, again, I do think, Mark, I think it's changing. I mean, if you look at right there in New York City, you will see somebody who is taking on, besides the Afro-Latino Forum, her name is Carolina Contreras. She has this Miss Rizos, campaign. She's talking about, the hair. In the Dominican Republic, we think about the blowout, and we see it all over the place, right? Hair is very political, how you wear your hair. Now, she has this campaign. She has this shirt. I have one of them right here. Yo amo mi pajon. And the pajon, here's this shirt right here. And it's this big campaign that she has not only in New York, she's doing it in the Dominican Republic. She's there teaching little girls, hey, we can embrace our hair. We don't have to straighten it all the time. That's something that's taking place where she's linking blackness and hair. So again, I think we're seeing it. It's exciting. I mean, some of the things that are taking place now. So I think there are some shifts here.
Okay.
And I think there's some shifts.
Robin?
I'd like to make a point. I do think that sometimes people, I think Dominicans do recognize blackness in ways that Americans can't always hear. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to give a couple of examples. In particular, the candidacy of Jose Francisco Peña Gomez. He was Haitian. He was orphaned during the massacre. He was undoubtedly the most popular. He ignited the population of the Dominican Republic, and he was a pivotal figure. He was probably the most important political and most beloved political figure of the 20th century, and he was shamelessly, race baited by Balaguer. And people usually go to Balaguer's race baiting and say, oh, well, obviously Dominicans are racist, but in fact, he was the only politician that ignited Dominicans. And so his, and Balaguer used race to try as a political tool to kind of erase that. Or the Haitian massacre. I mean, to my mind, this was a state act that was a brutal slaughter. And I think most Dominicans were terrified that they would be next. I mean, I did oral histories with massacre victims, and that was the message that I had. The Dominicans empathized, and they and it sent a message of subjugation to Dominicans too. So after the fact, of course, Dominicans got with the program in a way because that brutal slaughter kind of sent a message to Dominicans that I think Trujillo's project was also about finally making the Dominican Republic more powerful than Haiti, and that in that act, solidified a new power relationship on the island. But I think sometimes Or for example, I think that the category mixed or criollo includes blackness. It's just that Dominicans don't see themselves as only black, but that's not the only way to be black,
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think you all really pushed me to think about this in a slightly different way. For me, it was never the self-identification of blackness that I sort of prioritized. It was the kind of systemic rejection of African and African identity that we see throughout the diaspora that I find problematic. But what you all have told me is that's less the case, perhaps in DR than we think.
Much so.
Is that fair to say?
It is.
Very.
Well, then I just learned a bunch. And I think the HuffPost Live community learned a bunch too. Biani, Christopher, Silvio, Kimberly, Robin, thank you all for joining us. It really was a great conversation. I want you all to continue to weigh in on the conversation.
Thank you.
Before I go, I just want to throw a few comments out from the HuffPost Live community. Sarita Teresa wrote in and said, self-hate, internalized racism, and white supremacy are reasons for the condition in DR. Brigitte said, preach, Biani Perez. Get at the core of the issue. Challenge the core of patriotism. How can you not understand that blackness incorporates a mixture? Blackness is never just one thing. How can you not see that but can see that for being a Dominican? Ibrahim says, people should be free to identify as whatever they want without pressures. I'm a brown South Asian, but I don't like the notion that someone who sees me judges me by my ethnicity. I don't think of myself by skin color. That must be an awesome planet you live on, Ibrahim. Anyway, thank you for watching HuffPost Live. Just messing with you, Ibrahim. Stay with us. Lona Minkowski's up next.